So I'm going to talk to you about what consumers are doing with their mobile phones, but more importantly, what companies can do with the data that's coming out of the mobile phones. Okay, so the mobile economy today in 2017 is about 4% of the world's GDP. That's only 4%, which means that it's only going to grow exponentially from here. That 4% today is worth $3 trillion. Okay? So my job, or my sort of goal in the past decade or so has been to explore ways in which companies can monetize that data to create value for us consumers. Okay? So let's start with the graph. Since I'm a data geek, I like my graphs. So what you see on the screen is you see there are 5 channels from which consumers get information, right? The internet, mobile, print magazines and newspapers, television, and radio. These are the 5 primary sources from which consumers consume media. Okay? Now, what you see is the blue histogram on each of them tells you how much money are companies putting in advertising on each of these. So, for example, on the extreme left with print, you see that consumers are only spending 4% of their daily time reading newspapers or magazines, but companies are putting in 12% of their advertising budgets in newspapers. So clearly, it's a massive loss of efficiency there, right? Why would a company want to put an additional 8% of their money in a media that we don't consume? In contrast, if you look at radio, TV, and the internet, all 3 of them are fairly at a stable equilibrium. The dollar proportion of advertising money is very, very similar to the time that we are spending. If you look at mobile, we have the opposite problem as print, which is that consumers, we are spending 28% of our media consumption on smartphones and tablets, and yet companies are only spending 20% of their ad dollars. So there is a 7% gap, which in the US alone is worth $16 billion. Okay? So I work with a number of companies in the ecosystem, telecom providers, brands, and advertisers, and we try to figure out how to monetize that gap. But if you look at beyond the US, if you look at the next 5 countries by mobile spending, that's basically China, India, South Korea, Germany, and Brazil, that number very quickly escalates to more than $100 billion. Okay? That means $100 billion is waiting to be monetized just in the form of advertising. And I'm not even talking about other aspects of life, such as healthcare or public utility. Those are an additional amount of money. Okay? So the question that has been of interest to me is how do organizations leverage the mobile ecosystem to create value? Okay? But I try to balance it from both sides. I'm very much interested in value for companies, but I'm also a lot more interested in creating value for us as consumers, being a consumer myself. Okay? So what's the situation looking like right now? So the key takeaway from the previous slide is there is evidence, right, that we consumers are increasingly using mobile devices. It's touching every meaningful aspect of our life, but companies are underinvesting and underutilizing mobile. Okay? And depending on where you are, sometimes the gap is in double digits. So that's not necessarily good news. But what I've done over the last decade or so is to explore why that underinvestment or underutilization happens. Why are brands and companies underinvesting in a media that consumers are spending increasingly more of their time? There are 2 reasons. First, there are apprehensions or fears about the use of consumer data. And you notice that I have added the word unwarranted, which I emphasize probably the most important aspect of my talk. These fears, as I have walked across these different continents from South America to North America to Europe and Asia, what I've realized basically is that these apprehensions are for the large part unwarranted. In other words, consumers are actually not as much worried as companies think they are. Okay? Number 2 is more of an analytics piece. So my background, like I said, is I'm a data scientist with my training in artificial intelligence. And what we have done over the last 10, 15 years is try to explore which metrics and which AI, artificial intelligence models, should we be using to measure the effectiveness of dollars spent versus the actual returns on investment. Okay? So it turns out that as organizations, and I'm also guilty of that myself, since I work and consult with organizations, we have not, up until now, been effective in measuring the return on investment. Okay? So 2 reasons why companies underinvest in mobile. So the key question that come up is, so what do we do about it? We're going to start by thinking about a very fundamental question. So what's new and different about mobile, right? I mean, mobile is primarily a device to access the internet. So suppose that, you were to think about this, what's new and different about mobile? Okay? That's sort of the first step in understanding what consumers do and how companies can create value. Number 2, what do we know about consumer behavior? And I recently wrote a book about this, where we have seen 4 very interesting behavioral contradictions. What consumers say versus what we do. What we say versus what we do, there's a big gap. We say something and we do the opposite. And this is not just about consumers in the US. It's very true of consumers in Europe, in Asia, in South America. Same story everywhere. We say something, we do the opposite. And then I'll finally walk you through 6 use cases to give you an example of how AI is going to be used in the mobile ecosystem along with other aspects of our life, such as wearable devices, or my Alexa at home, or my smart TV. I'm going to wrap up by giving you these use cases, okay? All right, so let's think about this for a second. What's new and different about mobile as a channel? Okay? So the answer basically boils down to the fact that, number 1, by definition, it's always with you, so it's portable, right? You're not carrying your computer with you, but you're carrying your mobile with you, so it's always portable, it's with you. Secondly, beyond being portable, it's also unique to you. You might share your computer or laptop with your friends or family, but you're probably not going to be sharing your smartphone. Okay? 4 members in a household, if all of them are adults, most likely all of them have their individual smartphones, right? We don't share phones, but we share laptops and computers. What that means is that the data that is being collected by the ecosystem from your devices, especially from your smartphones, is very, very unique to each one of us, okay? So, number 1, it's portable, it's always with you. That means we always have data about you. Number 2, it's unique to you. That means the data that we have about you is really about you, okay? So, what does that mean? The single most important asset, data asset that is coming out from your phone is your location data, okay? But data actually is like an onion, right? So you peel off the layers of an onion, okay? As you add different layers of an onion, it grows bigger and bigger and bigger, right? But each layer actually has a slightly different taste to it. It's probably not very perceptible to the human taste, but it is a scientifically proven fact that each layer of an onion has a slightly different composition, okay? So in many ways, your location data is actually like an onion. And the reason I say so is because from your location data, if you add something more to it, you get something more about the consumer. Such as, if you add time to location, then you get a sense for the context of the person. For example, let's say it's Tuesday, working day, 2 p.m. in the afternoon, you're walking down a major Park Avenue in New York City, and 2 particular organizations are about to send you a message. One is Starbucks, say, hey, buy 1 coffee, get 1 free, and the other is a beer pub. Let's say buy 1 beer, get 1 free, okay? So a given individual, John Doe, gets targeted by 2 brands, okay? 2 p.m. on a Friday afternoon on a working day, on a Tuesday afternoon working day, most likely John Doe is going to go for the Starbucks. But you change the timing from 2 p.m. to 8 p.m., at the exact same location for the exact same person. Now what happens is John Doe starts redeeming the coupon for the beer pub. So when you add time to location, you get context. What might be the possible intent of the consumer as he is walking around? What else you know? You know the weather. When you know somebody's location, you know the weather. You know what is a real-time weather looks like. What else you know? You know the trajectory of the person, okay? So for example, you are in an airport or you're in a shopping mall and you go from the ground floor to the first floor to the 5th floor, and you come back to the basement, you go back to the 3rd floor. Your phone's always with you. It's constantly creating a trail of information about you, which is of immense value to organizations, okay? Whether it's airports trying to minimize congestion, and I'll talk about some work we are doing with airports trying to minimize congestion, or shopping malls trying to figure out what sort of an offer should I give this person to put money back in your pocket. What else you know? From your location, right, I get a sense for how crowded the situation is, okay? So right now, for example, if you have information about any one of you from your smartphones, we know that you're sitting in a room, roughly 100 people or so it's decently crowded. But we also know the opposite. When you're walking around downtown Warsaw and it's not crowded, we know that as well. Okay? So on and so forth. Basically, going back to my analogy of an onion, as you add layers, as you peel off the layers of an onion, right, you get to see what's inside. The same idea happens with location data. As you add additional layers to location, you get to see more and more about what's going on in the mind of the consumer. And that is essentially the story that I'm going to talk to you guys about. Okay, I'm going to walk you through some examples to give you a sense for what the next 5 years of the evolution of the smartphone is going to look like. So let's first define location. Location is very broad. Okay? So 10 years back, when was the first iPhone invented? January 2007, more than 10 years, right? At that time, the precision of location information available to the ecosystem was very, very low. We could hardly identify somebody from maybe 100 meters, maybe 200 meters, but certainly not below 100. Today, the latest iPhone 8 and the Samsung Galaxy 8 can identify the location of an individual person with 97% accuracy within 1 feet. Okay? That's basically between here and here. And on top of that, if you look at what's happening with some of the new developments by chip manufacturers like Qualcomm and Broadcom, that precision reduces from 12 inches to just a couple of inches. Okay? So for example, there are retail stores and shopping malls in Europe that are working with chip manufacturers that actually have these sensors in LED bulbs. And LED bulbs have a very high frequency. So the definition of location has changed dramatically. There's very fascinating new technology called heat mapping. Maybe some of you have experienced this already. But for sure, we've all experienced this online. Each one of us in the room, anytime you browse the website of an e-commerce retailer, this thing has happened to us. Okay? They have monitored every click, which part of the website we are browsing, what content are we consuming, and so on. Now imagine that whole idea being brought to bear in real life, in the physical world. Okay? So as opposed to saying, which particular page of Amazon was I clicking on before I clicked on this site, now what we are looking at is, in the real world, before I went to store A, what was the previous store I went to? Okay, and what is the next store I'll go to? So the next 5 years, essentially, we're going to see analogies from the e-commerce world being played out in the real life. Okay? So that's the topic of my book, and I've identified these 9 forces in the book that are going to shape the next 5 years or so, maybe longer, but certainly for the next 5 years. And like I've talked about before, I'm going to give you some examples of how we are getting there. Okay? So first, let's talk a little bit about consumers. I told you I'm going to talk about 4 consumer behavioral contradictions. Okay? First and foremost, when we have surveyed people in a face-to-face context or in an online context and ask them, how many of you are spontaneous and impulsive? Okay? Most people will say, yes, I am spontaneous and impulsive. But when we actually observe their actions in real life, turns out they'll value certainty a lot more. So we say we value impulsiveness, but turns out in reality we value certainty. Number 2, most consumers will say, oh, ads are annoying. They're very intrusive, they're overwhelming, they're very, very irritating. But same consumers who say that also have what we call FOMO, which is the fear of missing out. Okay? So from country to country, whenever we've done these studies, we've seen this dichotomy. They say that they don't like ads, but they also actually value the information that's being thrown out at them through the same ads or emails or offers and so on, because they don't want to lose out on what's going on. They have a fear of missing out. Number 3 is called the choice paradox problem. Most consumers again say, yes, give me choices, I like my choices, but when you give them choices, they also complain about too many choices. So they actually want the ecosystem to make decisions for them in many cases. And last but not the least is the most interesting of them, consumers around the world, again, across the 4 continents where I've worked, I've come across people saying, yeah, we really care about the value and the privacy of our data, but the same consumers are increasingly more than willing to give up information in return for some convenience or economic benefit. Okay? So show of hands, how many of you will give up your friend's email address for a slice of pizza? Show of hands. 1, 2, 3, 4. So the 4 of you are actually reflective of the majority of the world. The rest of you are not. You are the minority. I'm not making this up. Study after study have shown that consumers are willing to give up the email addresses of 3 of their closest friends or family for 1 slice of pizza. Okay? So that's one of several studies that we have done in a much more non-trivial context. Okay? Will I share my location information with the shopping mall because the mall will put 30% money back in my pocket? A resounding yes. Okay? All right, so in 2005, when I started working on this about 12, 13 years back, this was the other way around. Okay? So people will say, no, we don't want money back in our pocket. We don't enjoy convenience. We really enjoy preserving the data that exists about us. In 2017, this is what it looks like. Again, just to remind us, it's not just in the US, this is also true in Europe. I'll talk about a studies in Europe that I've done with 374 cities and towns in Europe, with 3,500 companies here in this continent, where I see this as well. Okay, the second issue, remember I said, was that organizations, including me, we were ineffective in measuring the returns on investment. And here's an example of what I mean. When I talk with CMOs, I work with CMOs or VPs of marketing quite often, and one of the common complaints I'll get is, only 4% of our consumers are buying our products on smartphones. That's not a big number, so why should I care? Okay? So then I ask them, have you actually looked at the entire path to purchase? If you look at the entire path to purchase, what we have shown and seen consistently is that between 35 and 40% of all purchases, including offline purchases, happen to be triggered and influenced by the smartphone. Meaning, for example, the first time you might have heard about a product or seen an ad or got an email about a product would have been in your smartphone, and then you might have seen it on TV, or you might have gone into an offline dealer showroom and bought the product, but the trigger happened through the smartphone. Okay? So let's talk about some examples of use cases for mobile. I'll give you across the spectrum, since I worked with different kinds of the mobile economy, from just text messages to mobile apps to mobile videos and mobile advertising and so on. I'll focus primarily on the world of business and marketing, but towards the end, if I have some time, I'll talk about the work that we are doing with hospitals and healthcare to make our lives better. I'll also talk about urban planning and working with some airports in the Middle East to improve congestions and so on. But the most interesting thing of this is that, as I'm sure this is the right crowd to talk about the value of AI and artificial intelligence, we're going to see more and more of these applications. The core idea is whatever we have learned from the e-commerce world is basically back to the future. We are now going to deploy the same learnings in the offline world, and that's where AI is going to be tremendously useful. Okay? So what, in a nutshell, have we learned in the last decade or so? We basically learned, number one, mobile is highly effective. You just have to make sure you use the right metrics. We have proof. Okay? Again, across 4 continents and half a dozen countries, we have proof it works. It is unequivocally the closest you'll get to a consumer. But there's a straightforward, simple formula that works. You want to use, as an organization, if you want to leverage this new AI-powered data and analytics and get to know your consumer and build trust, you have to act like a butler, like a concierge, not like a creepy stalker. Okay? So the companies where I've seen success are the ones who understand that line between a helpful concierge that delights you and surprises you versus an annoying, creepy stalker that obviously antagonizes you. Okay? And there's a very thin line. So as we go around, we will talk about some of these examples too. Okay? So let's start with some of the earliest work I did. This was in the Far East in South Korea. So I'd worked with South Korea Telecom and Korea Telecom. These are the 2 largest telecom providers. And here's an example. This is the city of Seoul. If you've been to Seoul, you recognize the Han River that divides the city from north to south. So here's John Doe. John Doe leaves home on a certain day, and from home he goes to office. From office he goes to a third location, could be a client call or a shopping trip, and then he comes back home. Okay? So Monday to Thursday, this is a typical trajectory of John Doe. We don't care who John Doe is. All we need to know is there's some uniquely identified individual, and that's his trajectory. Now, on Friday or Saturday, or maybe some other day, he leaves home, he goes to office, he makes the same client call, but instead of coming back home, he makes 2 other stops. Okay? Stop D, stop E, could be a restaurant, it could be a friend's place, and then he comes back home. This is basically the days when he's not commuting, he's deviating. Okay? So think about John Doe. On most days, he commutes from office to home and back. On certain days, he deviates. Every telecom provider in the world has this information about us. And the next battlefront is going to be essentially around this kind of data. Okay? So, I often get asked this question that, oh, Facebook and Google and Amazon have so much data about us. They have the best data. It's so scary. Okay? To some extent, yes. But you know the companies who have far better data about us? The telecom providers. Okay? So this is an interesting world because the world of telecom services per se, the regular text and voice and internet, is not as profitable anymore. It's actually very, very competitive. So in the next 5 years, you will see telecom providers are going to go up in battle against the Facebooks and the Googles and the Amazons of the world because they have now realized they actually know a lot about our patterns in the offline world, where the next battlefront is going to be. Okay? So we worked with a number of different telecom providers to basically understand how can we create value for consumers knowing this behavior. Okay? So one low-hanging fruit is, suppose I know that Monday to Thursday, John Doe is commuting, and Friday, Saturday, Sunday, he deviates. Okay? So how about I try to use that information to put money back in your pocket, in John Doe's pocket? Let's start with a simple idea. Let's give him some offers for Dunkin' Donuts or for Starbucks. Okay? So I know that at 8:55 in the morning, Monday to Thursday, he walks into his office, and there's a Starbucks right below the office. Okay? Why not surprise and delight him by giving him a 50% discount on anything in Starbucks? Okay? So we started looking at these sort of situations where, since we can distinguish between commuters and non-commuters, how do we create value for them? What we've learned is commuters only prefer one particular relevant targeted offer. They don't want to be overwhelmed with too many offers. Give them one. On the other hand, on the days when you're not commuting, when you have ample time to sort of explore, on that day you might be receptive to a second or a third offer. Okay? So Monday to Thursday, you want to get that Starbucks offer or whichever restaurant you go to for lunch. But Friday, Saturday, we might deviate. Okay? That actually ended up working really, really well. So we saw the highest redemptions from commuters given one offer only, whereas non-commuters preferred multiple offers, and so we ended up giving them multiple offers. So having understood that these are some ways in which we can create value from this location data, the next objective was to go to Japan and think about how now we can create an omni-channel synergy story. So this is Shibuya Crossings. Maybe some of you have been to Tokyo, very, very busy part of Tokyo, right? 1 million people cross it every single day. It's a bit like Times Square in New York City, right? Always crowded. Shibuya Crossing, or Times Square, has these massive electronic billboards, extremely valuable real estate space. So the next battlefront for LED screens or billboards is essentially going to be about, as John Doe passes through Shibuya Crossing, that's the gentleman in the middle with the blue tie, the ad that he will see on the screen is almost going to be talking to him. Okay? So Mr. Nakamoto is passing through Shibuya, and this is 2 p.m. on a Friday. There's an Apple store right there. You might be able to see the slogan. So Mr. Nakamoto gets to see an Apple ad on the screen, okay, along with everybody else, of course, right? But certainly he's there, so he gets to see that. And at that moment, the ad is being flashed for 2 minutes, and then at the same time, the telecom provider, NTT Docomo, sends an text message with an offer. Apple, to welcome Mr. Nakamoto, Apple store is 10 meters away from you, just 30 feet, and today you get a 20% discount on any Apple product. So that $1,000 laptop that he was about to buy for $1,000 just became $800. Okay? So when we explored this and we did these studies in different parts of the world, we saw that that synergy that you can create by showing somebody an offline ad on a screen and then, right at the same time, sending them a text message or an email with an offer, that increased redemption 7 times, 700% increase in redemptions. So people were, surprised, delighted, shocked, but it ended up working. And when we ended up following these archival AI-based models, we then surveyed them about what the reaction was and how they felt about it. And the most common reaction was somewhere between shocked, surprised, and delighted. But at the end, they were just happy. Because they're like, look, at the end, you put money back in my pocket. You just saved me $200 on that Mac Airbook. So that's the realization that consumers are slowly adapting to. Okay? Not everybody is the same, but people are slowly realizing that this data that exists about them is an asset. They can consider this an asset, and they are now willing to exchange the asset for some money. Okay? So here's my data, and give me some money. That's the realization that's going on. All right, so here's the study in Europe, and I'll give you an example from Germany. So here, what we did is we worked with 3,500 different brands and companies in Europe across 374 cities and towns, right? So it's a pretty big study. And it was done over a 2.5-year period because we were designing these randomized field experiments based on location. So this is an example of an app. It's a bit like Yelp. If you're familiar with what Yelp does, you open the Yelp app, it will show you all restaurants or whatever you're searching for in the vicinity of where you are. What this does, it actually expands, goes beyond restaurants, and basically says, let's incorporate hair salons or fast food places or apparel and retailer stores, whatever you have. And what we're going to do is a very simple exchange. So let's say the lady in the corner on the first row, she is 50 feet away from this store, and my friend Supreet here is 20 feet away from me. Okay? Now, how do I know this, or how does Telefonica, the German telecom company, how did they know this? Location, right? So it's in real time. So the idea is this Apple store or whatever, the fast food store needs to give Supreet a lower discount, and it needs to give our friend over there a higher discount because she's further away. The basic idea is somebody who's further away from you, you need to give them a stronger incentive to walk into your store. Otherwise, they're not going to come. So exchange distance for a discount. So if I gave Supreet 5%, I need to give her 15% because she's 3 times further away from him. That was the idea. So this is what we did in Europe, and people loved it because they basically understood that there is a simple exchange of cost of traveling or cost of transportation versus the value of the offer. So if you're 100 meters away, you get a higher discount. If you're 10 feet away, you get a lower discount. Okay? And then we did this in Asia as well, we did this in North America. So this is something that we have now consistently realized that consumers, primarily from the Generation Z and millennials, but also across Gen Y and Gen X, understand that location information can be used to create value for them. Okay? Now, of course, over time, what we've also realized is as consumers get savvy, they also try to game the system. So instead of walking directly into my store, I will strategically stop 50 meters from my store in the hope that you will give me an offer, right? So that's where AI is very useful. So we are using AI for fraud detection to figure out, these sort of manipulation. But obviously, we haven't nailed it. This is the beginning of, several years of work that we have to do to nail it. But more importantly, we realized that this is an exchange that consumers are willing to participate in. Another force is you go to a train station or an airport, you see lots of crowds. Okay? Does anybody know where this is from? Japan, right? So these 2 gentlemen are professional people pushers. They're called Oshios in Tokyo, and they have a very well-defined metric. During rush hours, they have to pack 11 people per square meter in every subway train in the city. Okay? That's their metric. 11 is, it's hard to visualize, but 11 is insane. I mean, it makes the phrase packed like sardines seem like an euphemism. Okay? But that's how it happens in Tokyo. So we started exploring this idea that when you put people in these crowded situations, in airports and bus stations and train stations, what do people do? Okay? In the olden days, we'd read a book or read a newspaper, but what do we do now? We take the phone out, okay? And we immerse ourselves into the phones, right? So whatever your commute is, your commute or 20-minute or 30-minute or 10-minute in public transportation becomes a great time for a brand to reach out to you with a message. So what did we find? We ran these massive field experiments in several cities around the world by sending people offers in crowded train stations, subway stations, bus stations, and airports, and just saw what people were doing. So it turns out that as the level of crowdedness increased, the redemptions also went up. Okay? So here's an example. This is from China. So I've talked about South Korea, Japan, Germany, Europe. Now this is an example from China. As the level of crowdedness increased from, on the x-axis, you've got number of people per square meter, 1% to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5. Look at how the purchase rates keep increasing. And these were massive samples, thousands of people. And the reason, essentially, we went back and then explored through various surveys what was going on. And basically, people said, look, when I'm in this strange, crowded contact with strangers around me, right, I don't make eye contact, right? It's not acceptable. I don't go about introducing myself. That'll feel like I'm awkward. That'll feel very awkward. So what I do is I take my phone out, and my phone becomes my escape, my device. And you have my undivided attention during my commute. Okay? Same reason why Google is into self-driving cars. Why is Google into self-driving cars? The moment you sit in a self-driving car, what are you going to do? You're going to take the screen out, you're going to start surfing. And they're going to monetize that surfing behavior by showing you ads, right? That's the big play that Google has. The same analogy that telecom providers who want to take on the Googles and the Facebooks is they know when we are in crowded contexts, meaning that we're going to take the screen out, and that time is a great time for a telecom mobile provider to send you an offer. It could be an offer from them, or it could be a partnership with any number of brands. And that's what we have done to explore these things. Okay? So the last one I want to talk about is something called trajectory. This is the most futuristic of them all. I'm going to show you a small video, another 2.5-minute video, just to give you a sense for how this is going to unravel. Okay? So let's take a look at the video first. And again, keep in mind that the analogy that we are thinking about is whatever we have learned from e-commerce, from Amazon, or from Alibaba, and I work with them both, we are using the learnings from Alibaba and Amazon in the real world, okay, with offline stores. Increasingly, right, we are moving to a world where it's becoming difficult for these offline retail stores to survive. Okay? In certain countries, for example, in the US or in China or in India, it's really, really, really difficult for these traditional brick-and-mortar companies to survive because they're getting hammered by the Amazons and the Alibabas of the world. Okay? So it turns out that there might be a glimmer of hope for them. And this glimmer of hope is actually this device that we all have. So in the future, we will see that increasingly shopping malls or department stores that had been suffering in the last couple of years from having to close down stores because of valuable real estate not being utilized to the best capacity, they can now try to come back and attempt to lure these customers who are only shopping online by giving them real-time surprises and delights and meaningful offers. Okay? The way it's going to happen is essentially going to be a combination of, you saw Wi-Fi over there, but this is still, the next few years, we're going to see far more than Wi-Fi. Okay? So I'll give you an example. So this is a shopping mall. As like most shopping malls, there are multiple floors and so on. So it's a very common behavior when consumers are shopping in a shopping mall. They also like to look on their smartphones and look for the reviews of the product that they are actually touching and feeling, and they also look for lower prices online for those products. So people want access to the internet on their smartphones even while they're inside a department store and shopping mall. Now, some of the larger stores like Macy's or Bloomingdale or Nordstrom in the US, they're so big that the LTE signal from the telecom provider doesn't often go through. You don't get internet, so these department stores and malls have started installing Wi-Fi. Okay? And that's essentially going to be the conduit for the creation of the value that I've been talking about. So 2 years back, we did the first of its kind project anywhere in the world, where essentially we leveraged the Wi-Fi in these shopping malls and used that information to create a value-based system with full transparency. So for example, the way this will happen is a consumer walks in through the entry, and as he looks for the Wi-Fi signal, there's an army of volunteers from the shopping mall or the department store that says a very simple message. Here's the user ID password for the Wi-Fi, and you have two options. If you opt in to share your trajectory information within the shopping mall with us, we're going to use that real-time information to send you offers and put money back in your pocket. If you don't want it, that's fine. It's totally up to you. But basically, it's your choice. You have been notified. Your data can be used to send you a targeted offer that, $1,000 leather jacket suddenly became $650 because of a 35% discount that we will give you. Or you can say, no, I don't want the money. You can't have access to my data. So 2 years back, we did this, and based on everything that I've done before in other parts of the world, I expected maybe 10, 15% of consumers to opt in. And mind you, this is across demographic. The youngest person we have is about 16, 17, and the oldest is well into baby boomers, well more than 60 years old. I was surprised to see that the lowest opt-in rate on a consumer population of 100,000 people that walk in every day was 81%. That's 81,000 people on a daily basis saying, yes, here's my data, location data, I opt in to share it, and you are going to send me an offer. All I care about is do not bombard me with too many coupons or too many offers. That's annoying. But if you promise me that you're going to send me just one or two relevant offers based on my trajectory, I would more than happily engage in this exchange. Okay. That was quite eye-opening for me personally because I hadn't seen numbers of that kind before. So we ended up working with several retail institutions around the world. Again, all these different continents I talked about. Some of them are big, 300 stores, 100,000 users on a daily basis. And the basic idea is if you want to create a trust relationship with the consumer, you have to notify them and give them consent, ask for the consent. The same idea that AT&T or Comcast in the US is saying, oh, if you want access to our telephone services and the internet, the full price is $99 a month, but if you opt in to share your browsing history with us, then we're going to give it to you at $69. So there's a $30 premium for your data. Okay? They first explored this in Kansas City, okay, which is not one of the largest cities in the US. And they saw massive opt-in rates. People are like, yeah, it's okay with me, because essentially you're putting money back in the pocket. The difference between this and what was happening before was, before they were still accessing the data, but they were not putting money back in the pocket. They were not offering us this exchange. Now the realization is the only way for this ecosystem to sustain itself is to create value for us, either in the form of convenience or giving us a direct economic discount. Okay? So anyway, we saw tremendous redemption rates. I won't bore you with all the numbers, but the response rates through these trajectory-based coupons were higher. And what we essentially leveraged was, in some prior work, we had worked with Alibaba and Amazon in 2 different countries, but we had used some deep learning and machine learning methods to understand how consumers behave in the e-commerce world. So I had created some recommender system for these companies. And the idea here with this mall was the same thing, that instead of saying you go from website A to website B to website C, or you go from the news page to the sports page, we are looking at, oh, you went to the Armani store, then you went to the Gucci store, then you went to the Burberry store. So can we predict the 4th store that you would go to? Okay, so the same idea, except that this is not in the online world anymore, in the offline world. And that's where we started seeing that as long as you do not bombard consumers with irrelevant, highly frequent, and not so relevant offers, people actually appreciate the idea. If you're sending them one coupon only with a substantial discount, right, they don't find that annoying. They actually appreciate that because it's money back in their pockets. So that's another way in which consumer behavior is changing gradually, slowly but steadily. Some things are changing faster in some places, some are slower. But we've seen this here as well, here as in Germany as well, where people are beginning to understand this simple economics of exchange. Okay? And the difference, like I said before, was before this was happening without the value being created for consumers. Okay? Okay, so I want to wrap up by just giving you some, some of the future work that we are doing. You've all heard about the Internet of Things, devices talking to each other. My refrigerator sending me messages for the kind of food I should be eating based on my, blood, my BP or my sugar in real time. So right now, me and my co-authors and other co-consultants are working with hospitals in different countries where using the wearable device data, we have instrumented like doctors and nurses and patients with wearable devices. And we're looking at two questions. One question is, do people who adopt these wearable devices make active changes in their lifestyle that shows up in concrete healthcare benefits, such as fewer doctor visits or fewer hospital visits? Okay? Does that happen? And number two, how can we actually improve the productivity of nurses and doctors? Patients care about higher engagement time with doctors and nurses. They care about lower waiting time. So as the doctors and nurses are walking around in hospitals, right, because they have the device and they have the mobile phone and through the Wi-Fi, we can again trace the trajectory. And what we realize is in some hospitals, for example, in the US and China, we have massive inefficiencies because it takes 2 minutes for the nurse to go back to the central nursing station where all the computers are and walk back to the patient ward. Okay? 2 minutes, here this way, 2 minutes. That's 4 minutes per patient per walk back and forth. If we could shave off even 40 seconds or a minute of that walk, that's a 25% increase in the productivity of a nurse, which in China alone is worth several $billion, and so is in the US. How do we know this? When we track the trajectory from the wearable devices, what we realize is, rather than centralizing all the information on the computers in the central station, why don't we just distribute it? So instead of them having to walk back 2 minutes, we will strategically install computers along the way between the patient ward and the nursing station so they don't have to come back all the way to access the electronic healthcare records. Okay? So even by shaving off 40 seconds from the 2 minutes, you save a lot of money. In the next 5 to 7 years, we are going to see several use cases of chips being implanted in individuals. It's initially going to be on an opt-in basis for obvious reasons. The other thing that's going to happen is that the apparel that we wear, okay, is going to be essentially all digitized. So our apparels are going to be sensing information about our personal biometric data and sending it back to the ecosystem, which insurance companies would then be using to subsidize premiums and so on. So, and the third thing I wanted to wrap up by talking about is how we are using this for urban planning. So there's some projects I'm involved in helping airports become more efficient. Okay? Some of the larger airports that have multiple terminals, we consistently see that they could do better in terms of the passenger transit time. So when you have connections, you have transit time, or you're waiting in a lounge or in a hall, okay? We can use the mobile data and the wearable data and the data from the Wi-Fi to minimize congestion. So where should the retail outlets be located within the airport? Should it be close to the most heavily crowded gates, or should it be strategically in the opposite part of the airport where the gates are not as popular? Okay? Should we make passengers walk more or walk them less to minimize congestion in airports? Okay? So all of these are essentially some of the future work that will happen in this space. And again, what we have to leverage is what we have learned from AI. So the work we have done before with deep learning of images, security cameras, or text mining of the content on the internet, all of this is going to be put together. And the hope is that that's where some of the real contributions of AI will be. Okay? And it's not just, we hear a lot about AI being used to take jobs away, but if I can ask you to trust me, there's also enough attempts being made to create new kinds of jobs. Okay? So to wrap up, how do we, what have I learned over the last decade or so of exploring this journey? it's really not so much about the models or the methods or the tools. Anybody who gets a little bit of training can do data science. Data science is not rocket science, not by even a close margin. Data science or AI being essentially is 99% is just diligence, just hard work. And there's 1% raw intelligence, which we all have. Okay? So one of the things that I have learned over time is that certain things will not change. The world will always have advertising. Okay? We will always have emails, coupons, apps, ads. It'll always be there. The reason is because 97% of the content on the internet is free. Somebody has to pay for it. So how do we make it better for us? Okay? So that's been my motivation. Like, how can I use the data and some of the skills I have to make it better? And first and foremost, I have to create value on both sides, right? So it can't be just companies making all the profits. We have to give consumers something back. And so it all starts by thinking about the fundamental problem. Right now, the problem is too many ads and too many messages, too frequent communication, but not so much relevance. So we have to change the equation and say, we're going to reduce the frequency with which brands and organizations are communicating with us and increase the relevancy. Okay? Number two is the organizations also have a tremendous responsibility to act like your butler and a concierge, your helpful butler and concierge. And we as organizations don't have excuses anymore for not doing so because the tools and the methods exist. So if we want, we can. It essentially helps up in generating consumer trust, which is going to be the fundamental building block for this ecosystem to survive. So at least my team, I couldn't obviously done any of this without our teams. And we have, large, very, very talented teams all over the world doing this. And we all fundamentally believe in that philosophy, that the value has to be generated on both sides. It has to be done in a way where consumers are being notified and the consent is taken and the organization is acting like a butler and a concierge. The good news is we have several examples from different parts of the world where this can happen. So our hope is in the next 5 years, as we spread the word, this is going to be more and more widely adopted. Okay?